Hello everyone and welcome back to a brand new Gamemaker tutorial. This one is very exciting. Today we're going to be learning how to make a cutscene. Now this is a very simple version of a cutscene. Basically what it does is it's meant to be a system that you can edit as a game developer that will allow you to move objects to a certain point, move them around, have them change sprites. There's also a lot of different things that this system can do. So like you'll be able to skip through cutscenes, you'll be able to play music, you'll be able to basically change the cutscene system in a very simple and approachable way to fit whatever needs your game might have. Now, I do want to stress that this system, well, two things. First of all, this system is probably overkill for cutscenes that have to do with revealing comic book panels to a player. Um, it's also like if you have like a slideshow you want to show, this tutorial is probably going to be overkill. Not to say that this tutorial isn't going to show you how to do that. It will show you a system that works for that. I just do want to say that this system is a little bit of overkill for that. The next thing I want to say is this system, a lot of it isn't really my system. This system is built off of Mimpy's textbox tutorial. He put out a great textbox tutorial, and then one day he said, hey, you could easily change this to accommodate a cutscene system. And so I went ahead and made the changes, and I made this tutorial for that to show you how you can expand the system that he originally created for cutscenes. So I would really recommend checking out his textbox tutorial. His textbox tutorial would actually work great for cutscenes like this if you want to add text into your cutscene. I know I have projects where this cutscene runs with text as well. And so I just wanted to point that out, just so that you know where this system is coming from and sort of what its limitations and what its abilities are. Basically, how this works is we have this system that tracks all of the possible options, all of different code segments to run, and then it spaces those segments out with its own timer, and it runs them. And that's all it really does. Basically, it's like you have a bit of code that you want to run, and then it runs sort of like a book. Like it goes the next page, the next page, the next page, and so on and so forth. Very simple stuff. So what we're going to do for that is first, because cutscene systems generally work with a game, I've set up some very simple objects right here. And they aren't anything crazy. So the first thing I set up is this enemy object. It has no code in it. It doesn't matter if it does or if it doesn't. And basically I've set up two sprites for it, this sprite and this sprite. Nothing fancy. Alright. The next object I've set up is the player. Now the player, very simple. So this player has a very simple state machine in it. It basically tracks if it's in a cutscene or if it's not in a cutscene. Ideally, you would have a more complete player with more complete states, and one of those states would be this cutscene state. So like basically the idea is that for this to work, for a player to not have any control during a cutscene, you have to be able to tell the player when it's in a cutscene and when it's out of a cutscene. And I did it with this state machine. You can do it whatever way you want, but this is the way I like to do it. We have very simple movement here. Obviously, your game that you're probably putting this cutscene into is going to be more complex. So free basically allows the player to move around, and when the player is in a cutscene, the player is no longer able to move around. Simple stuff, right? And you can go ahead and skip all of this. It should be time-stamped down below. Now, this next part is 100% necessary for your game. So this here is a cutscene hitbox. And right now, it's visible in the game. If I want to make it invisible to the player, I can just add a draw event and put nothing in it. That means that it'll basically be invisible, but the player can still collide with it. So there's a few things we want to put here. So basically we want a variable definition. So what is a variable definition? Well, the nice thing about variable definitions is that you can edit them in the room and have each one be unique. So I could have another object of this, and it would get its own variable that we could edit. So each one will be unique. And then this one, the variable is going to be called activate cutscene, and the type is going to be a string, and the cutscene we're going to activate is cutscene. And I'll go through all of this later. This is just, sort of setup stuff. So we have that right now. This is like the default value. This is if we don't set it in the room. I just set it to debug. Generally have a debug cutscene and stuff like that just to show like, okay, I haven't set up something proper here yet. But that's what we have here. So this variable definition, very important. And then what we have is basically we're going to be checking if we are touching the player. And if we are, we're going to create a cutscene manager. So the X, the Y, and the depth doesn't matter for the cutscene manager. However, this next part does. So this is topic name, activate cutscene. So as you can tell, hey, this is going to put in whatever cutscene we want to run that we're going to be storing as a string. We're going to give that to the cutscene manager. And the cutscene manager's topic name is going to be this. So that's how that works. And I'll show you once we get to the cutscene manager object in a second. And then we're just going to destroy this instance. So basically all this does is it starts a cutscene once the player has reached a certain point. So let's go into the cutscene manager. Alright, so this is really the meat and potatoes of the system. In Mimpy's tutorial, this would be the textbox object. But for us, this is going to be our cutscene manager. So first, variable definitions. There's a few important ones here. The first is the topic name. We also set it to debug. This is going to be a string. So this is going to be it deciding what cutscene it wants to run. And we're going to have a list of cutscenes. I'll show you how to do that later. There's a lot of complex parts here, but as long as we set each one up fine, it'll work. So object array. So this is going to be all of the objects we have to edit to put them into a cutscene state. So generally, like each time we start a cutscene, we want the player object to be in a cutscene state, and there might be other objects we want to set into a cutscene state. So like if there's an enemy that we want to be in the cutscene, we might want to put them in a cutscene state as well. So that's what this is supposed to do. And then this skip cutscene boolean true. This is a boolean, and we're going to want to make sure that's false for now. That's false as default. I'll show you how to do this. Basically, all you need to know is that this makes sure we can skip the cutscene. So this here is a script. This is our create event for our cutscene manager. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to set up a script. So you can right click and create a new script. This is my script, the SCR Initialize cutscene object. So basically all you have to do to create this is right click, hover over create, click script, and then this will open up this panel to be able to edit this. So we're going to write function SCR Initialize cutscene objects, an array of objects. And this part here, this is just the default value. So if we plug nothing else in, it'll run this. We don't necessarily need this part, but we do need this variable. And then basically what this does is this is an array, and for all the objects in the array, we're going to go into them. And this one specifically, we're going to check, okay, this is the player. So the player has a state variable inside it. You know, the one we set up earlier. This part. So the player has a state variable inside it, and we want to set that state to the cutscene state. And basically, we can expand this. So like if there's a particular enemy we want, like, objects underscore index is equal to obj underscore boss, for instance, we can set it up the same way. This is just for scaling the system later. But for our very, very simple tutorial today, we're just going to omit that. And then basically this will just return nothing. And then end cutscene. So when the cutscene ends, we want to free all of the objects we previously used. So in this case, we set it equal to the free state. Now, depending on your state machine, this might be like idle or something. It'll just sort of depend, right? Remember, this is literally just to tell the player not to move during a cutscene. And this system could be expanded to tell other things not to move normally during a cutscene. Like if you have just some sort of cutscene boolean in your player object, you could just do that, and you can set it to false down here. It really doesn't matter. This all depends on what you have in your game. Cutscene systems have to be developed around the game that they're being put into. Like there's no one size fit all. So this is just me trying to give the option later on down the line to edit these objects before the cutscene, to prepare objects for a cutscene. So that's how that works. Alright, so we're going to set up a skip key so that we can skip the cutscene if we want. This is cutscene array. We're going to be using it later. Cutscene position. So this is basically going to track like the pages of a book. Like, okay, what do we have to do on this page? And then this is basically the page number, right? So I'll explain that in more detail later. So this is the current action. So basically what we're going to be storing is we're going to be storing code snippets inside our cutscene, with the understanding that each code snippet is going to be run a little bit differently. So our current action, the one we're currently on, that's where we store that. So this is how we start the cutscene. So set cutscene equals function topic. And then what we do here is our cutscene array is now equal to global topics $topic. So this format right here, this is for accessing out of a struct. It's called an accessor. And we're going to have a struct that contains every single cutscene in our game. That's where we get this global.cutscenes. Now, this probably won't highlight for you because we haven't set this up yet. But I'm going to walk through the entire cutscene manager code, and then we're going to go into these details here. So this resets the cutscene position to -1. And then this next function we're going to set up, well, next. So as you can see, next, basically once this page is done, once we're done with our current position, we're going to want to move on to the next page of the cutscene. And if our new cutscene position is more than or equal to the length of our array, basically if we've reached the end of the quote-unquote book, we're going to destroy our text box. Then what we do, if we haven't reached the end of all the cutscene pieces we want to play, then we're just going to say, then we're just going to move on to the next page of our book. Skips cutscenes. So this is something I added in later. This obviously isn't in Mimpy's tutorial. Basically, we want to do something different if we are trying to skip the cutscene. So in this case, we're just going to check if we are trying to skip the cutscene. And if we are, basically the same thing here. This will just check if we've reached the end of the cutscene manager. And if so, delete ourselves. Otherwise, we're just going to, with our current action, skip. And I'm going to show you how to do this later. Trust me, I know this looks confusing, I know this looks scary, but we're going to get into it. Alright, and then what we're going to do, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to set our cutscene. So basically this right here gets the cutscene we're going to currently run. And as you can see here, topic name, that's what we set before in our obj hitbox. So this is where we set the cutscene we want to run. So if we have our cutscene name like, I don't know, first level cutscene, whatever, something like that, right? Then that can run just like that, just fine. But right now, so that's how we set up that variable. That's how we use that variable. So basically, this is just going to set up functions and variables we're going to use later, and this is going to start our first cutscene. Next, let's go to step event. So basically, what this does is this is going to check if we pressed the skip button in our keyboard, and if so, we're going to set up to skip the cutscene. So this is just a system for skipping the cutscene. It's very simple. Now this is the main meat and potatoes of the system. So this is just going to run our cutscene code. And each function, we're going to build it out of functions so that each element of our cutscene can run slightly differently. So basically what we're going to do is, if we aren't trying to skip the cutscene, we're going to run this. And our current action.act ID. So I'm going to explain this a little bit later. I know it's very confusing. But our current action is basically the code we need to run on our current page of the cutscene. So as you can see, this is equal to the cutscene position, right? So this is going to store a constructor, and that constructor is going to be a function that has code in it, and that's the function we're going to run for each step of our cutscene. And then we have the destroy event, and all this does is it checks if we are the last instance of cutscene manager, and if so, we're just going to end the cutscene. So this right here, this is just going to free the player object. Very simple stuff. Alright, so that is all we need for objects and things. I know that's probably looks a little bit daunting. I know it doesn't make a whole lot of sense right now, but we are going to expand it and explain it. And that comes into the other scripts we're going to make. So let's go down here into our scripts and to our cutscene scripts. So we already made this initialize objects and end the cutscene scripts. Now what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to set up our cutscene. So how this is going to work is very, very simple. This is the cutscene that I played at the very start of the video. Basically what this does is it takes an object. So like as you can see, this is the action we want to do. So I have a few actions set up here, and I'm going to go through each one and how they work. So this one literally is supposed to just move an object around, move an object to a point. And we define it with what object and what point and how long it's going to take them. So the system I'm using, basically we can change the amount of frames it takes in between each item. So like it's a little bit like keyframes. So like this is how long it's supposed to take us to get from the player's current position, we leave this blank for current position, and the end position, right? And then there are some other things here. So this wait function, all it does is the cutscene does nothing until this timer goes off. And this here, all this does is it sets the sprite of a certain object. So basically what we're going to need to do here, I know this is very daunting. For now, all you have to write is global.cutscenes is equal to a new struct. And in that struct, we're going to set cutscene equal to this array. So like make sure that this is in brackets, this is in brackets. You don't have to write any of this part. We're going to write that later. All you have to do is write this for now. All right? Easy as that. So let's go into what these are. I'm sure you've never seen these red ones before. So these are what's called macros. And all a macro does is it basically just replaces anywhere in your code that has this in it with this. So like if we were to just write this, it would literally be the same thing. So this macro right now is holding a constructor. But I use macros and Mippy uses macros just to keep things a little bit cleaner, just to keep things a little bit nicer. Generally, these are supposed to be a little bit shorter than the script name itself, and you don't have to write new. So that's how we keep that. So we're going to set up a constructor for our cutscene actions. So this is going to be our default constructor. So constructor, how should you think about it? A constructor is basically a struct. It's an item that's meant to hold data. However, a constructor is sort of more like an object. So there are like instances of constructors. It's like an object you make in code. And you set everything up in code. It's very, very complicated, but it's a very, very powerful data structure. So for this, the best way to think about it is we have to set up a constructor where we set it up as function, the name of the type of constructor. So this is like the object index. And then this just makes sure that Gamemaker knows, okay, this is a constructor. And then all the code for the constructor is meant to go inside. So we can declare variables inside. We can say it's x is equal to 100, whatever. And then this is sort of like a, well, this is a function. So for our intents and purposes, this is going to run in the step event. And this is going to be like the step event for an object. So this is what we want to have running. We're going to put code in here for what we want running each step. So you can think about this part is like the create event of an object, and this part is like the step event for an object. So what we want to do here is we want to, for each cutscene action that we're going to make, these are all like variations of a cutscene action. And what we want to do is we want to make sure that it has an act function. So this is what should happen each step for that part of the cutscene. And it has a skip action. So this is if we're skipping through the cutscene. So that's all we have to set up for that. Now, let's go ahead and let's set up, I have a lot of different ones here, but we're going to set up this one for now. I'm just going to move it back up to the top. So, I know this looks very scary, but bear with me. So basically what we're going to set up is we're going to set up a constructor very similar. So we're going to say function. We're going to call this SCR for script object go to. So this is going to move objects between two places, right? And then what we're going to do is we're going to make sure, so I'm just going to X that out for now just so you can focus. So you can copy this, you can paste this here, and then what we're going to want to do is we're going to put this semicolon, and we're going to do script cutscene actions constructor. So that basically tells Gamemaker, like, okay, this is a child of this. It needs to have an act and a skip function in it. And if you don't set one up, it'll default to using one of these, which has nothing in them. So that's what we're going to want to set up. And then what we're going to want to set up is we want to have some data in here. So we want to be able to set this up here. So as you can see, this has variables in it, and those variables control certain things. So what we're going to want to do is first, we're going to want to know what object we're editing. So we're going to want to pass in an object. Next, we're going to want to know what start position we're starting from. Now, I've set it up here so that the default is no one. And the reason I've done it that way is not every time we want to set up a start position. Sometimes we want to just start it from wherever the object is currently. But I still want to add in an option so that we can set this up if we need to. Now, if we're going to move the object, we absolutely have to know where the end position is. So we're just going to store that in a struct, whereas an x and y. And finally, we're going to set up this timer. Now, the default is a 60 frame timer. So you might be wondering, Gatsby, what is this timer thing? Good question. So that's something else we have to set up here. So The same way we set up our cutscene actions script and the same way we set up our cutscene script, we're going to set up a SCR timer script. So you can just right click, create script SCR timer. So this here is also a constructor, you might notice. However, it's not the same as, it's not a cutscene action, so it's its own type of constructor. Basically what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to set up frames and init frames. So what does this do? So this is meant to store how many frames the timer runs for. And this is meant to store, basically, like if we want this to be 60, but this to be 30, we can set it up like that. This timer object, timer constructor, you can use it for a lot of different things. It's basically like a simpler system than the alarm event in objects. But what this does is, so we're going to set up, so this timer constructor, it's always going to have a timer variable, and that's going to be equal to frames. And then it's always going to have a timer max value, and that's always going to be equal to frames as well. And then if our init frames is not equal to undefined, we're going to set our timer equal to that. Very simple stuff. Basically, like we can use init frames to set it for a lower value the first time it runs. That's all that does. And then we want to set up a few functions here. So these are our timer functions, and we've set them up using the static keyword. So basically static reset is equal to function frames. So basically what this does is this resets our timer. We actually don't need this part. This was part of functionality that I later removed, but I'm just going to leave it in just because. So all this does is sets our timer back to the maximum value. Is running. So basically this is going to check, okay, is our timer more than 0? And that's all that does. It just returns true or false. Static updating. So what this does is basically it moves the timer 1 closer to 0. So it subtracts 1 from the timer if the timer is more than 0. And it also returns the current value of the timer. And then this is a new thing I set up specifically for our cutscene object. This gets the percentage. So this basically stores, okay, how far through our timer are we? So this will be a number between 1 and 0, with 1 meaning we're at the very, very beginning of the timer, and 0 meaning we're at the very, very end of the timer. And that's all that does. So that is our timer object. And we're going to be using that a lot for our cutscene system, because all our cutscene system is trying to do is trying to understand, okay, we're trying to pass time in between certain events, and we're trying to manipulate events based on time. So let's go back to our cutscene actions script, and we're gonna scroll down. So that's all of this set up. So basically what we're going to want to store is these are all, see this self keyword? That means that all of this constructor specifically stores certain variables in it. So these variables are for this constructor and this constructor alone. So basically what we're going to want to do is first we're going to hold on to our timer. Okay, so we set up your own timer for this struct. This is going to be how long the cutscene takes to complete. Alright, so we set up a start position. This is going to be where the object starts from. We're going to set up an object variable. This is the object we want to edit. We're going to set up an end position where this is where we want to end up. And then this is just 2 variables we're going to use later. So, act. So what do we want to happen in the step event of the object that's running? Well, the first thing we're going to want to do is we're going to want to pass in the ID. So this here stores the ID of our cutscene manager. So the first thing we want to do is I just set up a local variable called obj self.object. That way I can just write it easier. And PERC, that's short for percent. So this is going to be self.timer.percentage. So if you remember, that's our function from our timer object earlier. That gets the percentage of how far through we are through the timer. And this is self.timer struct.updating. So we're going to want to update this timer each frame so that we actually go all the way through the timer. So basically what we're going to want to do next is we're going to want to get the starting position. Even if we don't have it set up here, we're going to want to set it up. So if the starting position is equal to no one, then we're just going to find our object starting x and y and set that to our starting position. Easy as that. So basically what this does is it uses percentage to get a value between our end position and our y position. So if this is 0.5 using this lerp function, basically what lerp does is you can find the value that equates to the position between two other values for a given percentage. So we're going to be, so like if we're 50% through the timer, we're going to be 50% between this point, our end position point, and our start point. Same deal for the y. Basically move between 2 points linearly. Simple stuff. And then what we're going to do is we're going to set, now that we've figured out where our current position is, we're going to set our object x and y to that position. Easy stuff. Now this next part, this is functionality I used in a different object. Obj underscore dir is equal to, so this points to the next where we're going. You don't technically need this part. This is all just sort of like checking stuff. So this here we can actually go ahead and remove all of this. Basically what this does is it checks what direction we're pointing in as we're doing this. But we don't need it, not for this example, and you probably won't need it for your game. This code is just kind of bad. Alright. Finally, this is to leave this segment of the cutscene. So what we're going to do is we're going to say if our timer struct is not running. So what that means is our timer struct has ended. We have reached 0. What that means functionally is our object has reached end position, and this segment of the cutscene is done. So what we're going to want to do is, first, we're going to want to reset our timer struct. If you don't do this and you try to run the same cutscene, this timer struct is going to be at 0. And that's sort of confusing. Like you'd think that, oh, like when it reset, like if the room resets, when it reset the timer as well. No, it won't. It will just stay the same. And that's because this is going to be declared in a global variable once. So we have to reset our timer to make sure that if we ever run the cutscene again, it'll run properly. And then all we do is caller.next. So if you remember, this is the ID of our cutscene manager. So our cutscene manager is going to run its next code, which will move on with the cutscene. So now that we have that set up, let's go ahead and put it in practice. So in our cutscenes script, basically all I did is create script cutscenes. So this here is going to hold every single cutscene our game runs. So what you do here is this will hold all the segments of our cutscene in an array. And then our cutscene manager is just going to run through them. So what I set up here is very, very simple. So first what we're going to do is we're going to move our player to the X position 542352. So generally I decide this by going in here and figuring out, okay, this point here in the room, that looks about right. It has the X value here, so I want to move the player to that position. So we're going to set that up. Easy as that. So we don't, sorry. Let me explain the macros real quick. I know you're probably still confused about that. So, as you can see, we're going to set up a new macro. Now that we have this finished, we're going to set up a macro, and we're just going to want to store this. So this, new, that. And then with that macro, all we have to do is we have to put this here. And then this is just going to be this script. You can do this without the macros. Just remember, you have to write the new beforehand, and you have to type out the entire script name. I just like to do it with the macros, and Mimpy likes to do it with the macros. So that is going to be our macro. And then so from here, we can pass in these arguments here. So our script is going to ask like, okay, what object do you want to edit? Oh, we're going to want to edit the player object. Okay, what start position do you want to set up, if any? Oh, we don't want to set up any start position, so we're just going to leave that blank, and we're just going to put a comma. All right, what end position do you want to set up? Remember, you have to store it as a struct. So we're going to store it as this struct, underscore x, underscore y, blah, 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 comma, and then, okay, how long do you want this segment to last for? And we're going to say, we're going to want to set it for, let's just set it at 30. Make the player move a bit faster. So now, this data is set up, and our cutscene manager is going to run this code here for the entire duration of our timer object. Simple as that. And you can set this up for a bunch of different stuff. Now you might see I put instance enemy 2 here. What that does is if I put obj underscore enemy, that's going to move every single enemy in the whole room, which is kind of a problem. So what I did here is I set up a unique instance ID. So this one is called instance enemy 1, and this one is called instance enemy 2. That means that when this cutscene runs, it knows, okay, only use this enemy instance. So that's how that works. So basically what I did here is I made the player move to a certain point, and then the enemy objects move around him. So we can see that here. Alright, so that cutscene works just fine. So, and then when the cutscene ends, you should be able to move around. So that's how that works. Now, another thing we want to make sure to do is this skip function. So basically what this does, all it really needs to do is ignore the timer. So what it's going to do is it's going to be set up similar to the act function. And it's going to get the object, and we're just going to set the object x to the end position x, the object y to the end position y. We're going to reset our timer just because, just for funsies, and then we're going to move on with the cutscene. So as you can see, you can chain all of these segments together to form a cutscene. That's basically what we did here, right? And you can set up different segments to do different things. So let's set up this wait and the cutscene set sprite stuff. So let's set up the wait first. This one is very simple. Very simple system. All our wait does is it sets up a timer. It takes a timer in. And all it does is it updates the timer. And if our timer is no longer running, then we reset our timer and we move on. And our skip function is basically just we reset the timer, we move on. Simple as that. So that's the wait function. All that does is just give us a little bit of time where nothing is happening. Alright, now let's set up the cutscene set sprite. So basically when you, well first, in order to manage the macros, you go up to the top here and you add cutscene wait. And remember, this new has to be there. It's very, very important. So that's the wait. So let's go ahead and set up our cutscene set sprite. So this one is meant to set the sprite of an object. This segment we can use to update the sprite of an object. So we're going to want to know, okay, what object sprites are we going to edit? What sprite are we going to set it to? Are we going to change the X scale? We'll just set it to 1. Generally, I set this to 1 or -1 because I have sprites that tend to face right or left. You don't necessarily need this. Like, I imagine if you're making like a top-down sort of thing, you might not need this one, but it could be useful. And this is going to set the visible. So sometimes I also want to set the sprite as invisible. And that's what this does. So same setup as before. All right, what's next? So now we set up this constructor's variables. So we're going to want to store the object, the sprite, the direction, and if it's visible or not. So you notice this one doesn't have a timer. That's because this is an effect that should take place instantly. If we don't want it to take place instantly, that's what we use the wait for. So not everything has to be timed out. Just some things where, you know, not every cutscene object needs a timer, is what I'm trying to say. So act. So we're going to want to take our object variable, and we're going to want to set its sprite index to the sprite. We're going to want to set its image X scale to the direction. We're going to want to set the image index to 0. You could set up another variable here. So index, right? I'm going to set that to 0. And self.index is equal to _int. So this will allow us to set the index of a sprite. Generally, when I'm animating a cutscene, I want it to be the first index, but that gives us a little more control, right? I just did that to show you, like, okay, this is how you edit the system for when you're making your own thing, right? So all of that running just like that. And then all we have to do is do color.next. And then the skip, basically the skip does the exact same thing. Because this isn't timed, we want to make sure that the sprite gets the correct. Basically, we want to make sure that the sprite gets the correct data. Oh yeah, we can add this in there too. And boom. So if we go back over to here, we're going to want to make sure that this index is set. So right after sprite, this would be where the index is. I'm just going to put a comma because I don't necessarily have to change anything here. In this case, I don't have to edit that part. But I just did that to show you, like, okay, this is how the variables go in, and that's how you use them. So there's a few other things here. We set the sprite. We set up the wait. This one here, I didn't use it in this cutscene, but this is if you want to create an object. So I use this a lot in my current game that I'm working on, Karam and the Worldwide Street Brawl. Link below if you want to play it, free online. But this just sets up an object. So if you want an object to appear, I just made it like that. Self.object is equal to object index, blah, blah, blah. So where we want to create it, what object we want to create, and what layer it's on. And then what we need to do is, with instance create layer, what layer it's on, what object index. This here sets the state to cutscene of the instance we just created. So like if you want to create an object that runs differently in cutscenes than it does inside cutscenes, that's that. Very similar to what we did in our initialize cutscene object state. We don't need it in this case. I'm not really using it, so that's just fine. Skip, gonna do the same thing. All right, what else? What else? Set sprite. Audio play. Okay, this is a new one. So if we want to add sound effects to a cutscene, this is how we would do it. So SFX, loops, generally we should set this to false. gain 1, pitch 1. So that way we can change the volume. Gain is just volume, another word for volume, and then the pitch. So how high or low it is. Same setup on the end. So the audio file, loops, gain, pitch, all that stuff. So act is equal to function, caller equals to ID, audio play sound, the audio file, 10 self.loops, self.gain, 0. Like basically just play an audio and move on. And for the skip, the only difference is that we don't play the audio. Easy as that. Set object state. This one I used to set object states. You can poke into it real quick. I'm not going to go over it as much as the other ones. Very, very simple. Basically what I have in my beat 'em up project that I was talking about earlier is I have some objects I want to animate like just through code. I don't want to necessarily worry about all this stuff. So I create a specific object for a cutscene, and then I have a state in that cutscene where it sort of does its thing. So all that stuff. And then basically what I have here is most of those objects in that other project destroy themselves. So I just destroy those objects when I skip them. Easy stuff. And yeah, so that's all of the big ones. I'm going to go ahead and show you another one in another project that's meant to set up a text box. So that text box specifically is working with Mimpy's text box. I'm just going to show you it real quick. Alright, so I just want to show you, this is just an example. Your text box might look differently, but this is how I did it using specifically Mimpy's dialogue from Mimpy's dialogue tutorial. That'll be links below too. You can go ahead and check Mimpy out. It's a great tutorial maker. So cutscene make text box, dialogue, cutscene actions, blah, blah, blah. This is just supposed to store what dialogue the cutscene needs to run. My cutscene made dialogue. This just stores some variables. Act. Self.made dialogue is false, so we want to only make the dialogue once. So if my cutscene does not exist, we're just going to want to set up our text jar, and then we're going to want to store the text jar object. We're going to make dialogue, and basically what this does is it stores the cutscene we just created, and it stores the text jar we just created. And when that text jar deletes itself, basically when that text jar ends, it's going to delete itself. And when it deletes itself, the instance will no longer exist. And we're just going to move on to the next stage of the cutscene. So easy as that. That's how that works. So just want to show that off just as like how it works. So basically, this is how the cutscene object works. You can make as many cutscenes as you want. You can name them differently. You can access them through just one string. And then you can make each one unique, right? You can build them out of these different segments. Now you may be asking me, Gatsby, there's one issue with your cutscene system. And the issue is you can't move two objects at the same time. Like what if I want to move this one and this one? You can't do it. So the system I have to fix that, it's a little bit jerry-rigged, it's a little bit janky, but I'm just going to show you how it works in case you run into this problem in the future. Move other object. So basically what I do for this, and I did this in my beat 'em up project for the cutscenes there, and literally what I do is I create another cutscene object. So this one is just going to move this enemy, and we're just going to move it to, I don't know, 0, 0. Take all the time you want, 120. Plenty of time. And what this is going to do is, what we're going to do here is we're going to create a new cutscene action. So scr_run new cutscene. There we go. So what we're going to want to do here is we're just going to want to be able to call this cutscene so that this cutscene and this cutscene is running at the same time. That way we can move two enemy objects at the very same time. I know that sounds confusing, but it should work with our system. Everything we set up. It's a little bit of a jerry-rigged situation, but you know what? It works. So we're going to want to define what cutscene we want. Cutscene is equal to string. I like to do the equal thing because that just tells me like, okay, this has to be stored as a string. So self.cutscenes dot cutscene is equal to underscore cutscene. All right, act. So what do we want to run? Well, all we really need to run, this needs to be caller ID. I should probably put this here as well. There we go. All we really need to run is we can run the very same hitbox code here. Let's go back to our script. Let's go back to our cutscene actions. Run that. Create a cutscene manager for the new cutscene that we're going to be running alongside this one. And the cutscene we want them to run is the cutscene we have set up, and then we can just do caller.next. Easy as that. And then for the skip, just going to do is equal to function caller is equal to ID again. And we're just going to do the same thing. Easy as that. Okay. So, now that we have that, let's go ahead and add it to our cutscene, shall we? So we're going to want to say, let's do it here. Oh wait, we're going to want to set up a macro. So let's copy this. Let's create a new macro. And then what do I want to name it? Dual cut. For dual cutscene. Easy that. And then, so we have to plug in the cutscene we want. So we're going to want to run this one. Let's see if it works, because I'm doing all this in one take and I have no idea. Alright, so as you can see, the object moved there at the same time that this object was moving. And now the cutscene is finished and we should see that everything still runs as expected. So that is how that works. That is my cutscene system. I've been the Great Gatsby. You have been very patient for reading through all of this, and I hope that if you encounter any issues, you will let me know. Thank you so much for watching, and have a lovely evening, old sport. I hope that this cutscene system works for you. Goodbye.